The Korvathian military academy squatted on the third moon of Zirion Prime like a titanium-plated monument to institutional arrogance, its spires reaching toward the stars with all the subtlety of a middle finger extended at the universe. For 3 centuries, it had churned out the galaxy's most insufferable military elites, each one more convinced of their species' superiority than the last. The Academy's motto, carved in 12 different alien languages above the main entrance, read, "Through superior breeding, victory." Charming bunch, really. Commander Vex'thor adjusted his ceremonial combat harness for the 15th time that morning, admiring his reflection in the polished obsidian walls of Training Bay 7. At 7 feet of rippling Korvathian muscle, complete with the trademark bone ridges and predatory yellow eyes that had terrorized lesser species across 3 star systems, he cut quite the figure. His service record read like a greatest hits album of interstellar intimidation, and his ego had grown proportionally with each victory. Today, he announced to his fellow instructors, we demonstrate why the Korvathian Empire leads the Galactic Defense Council. His voice carried that particular brand of smugness reserved for those who had never encountered anything capable of deflating it. The betting pool had reached astronomical proportions. Instructor THYSSRA, her serpentine Naxalite frame coiled around a hover platform, had wagered her month's salary on the human lasting less than 30 seconds. Professor Grimtalk, whose Argothian ancestors had once bench-pressed small asteroids for entertainment, gave it 20. Even the notoriously cautious Zelthrians, with their hive-mind tactical processing, had collectively decided the human wouldn't survive the opening exchange. The source of their amusement stood quietly in the corner, methodically checking her equipment with all the fanfare of someone preparing to do laundry. Lieutenant Maya Chen looked like the galaxy's most unimpressive disappointment, barely reaching 5.5 feet in her regulation training gear. No impressive bone protrusions, no natural armor plating, no visible weaponry beyond standard issue. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her brown eyes held an expression that could generously be described as mildly interested. "Behold," Vex'thor gestured grandly toward Maya, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain, "the pinnacle of human evolution. Earth sends us their finest, and we receive." He paused for dramatic effect. This. A ripple of laughter echoed through the observation deck, where cadets from 17 different species had gathered to witness what promised to be the shortest combat demonstration in Academy history. The Korvathian cadets were particularly amused, their bone ridges practically vibrating with belly-contained mirth. Even the usually stoic mechanoid representatives seemed to be running additional humor subroutines. Maya finished her equipment check and looked up, catching Vex'thor's attention with the sort of patient expression usually reserved for explaining basic concepts to particularly slow children. "Ready when you are, Commander," she said, her voice carrying just the faintest trace of what might have been amusement. The Academy's combat protocols were as elaborate as they were pointless, a ceremonial dance designed more for theatrical value than practical assessment. Each evaluation bout followed the same tedious script: formal challenge, ritualistic posturing, dramatic proclamation of species superiority, followed by the inevitable crushing of whatever poor soul had drawn the short straw. Vex'thor had performed this routine exactly 437 times over his career. He had broken the spirits of Centaurian berserkers, reduced Phalanxian tacticians to quivering masses of insecurity, and once made a draconian fire-breather actually apologize for existing. Today's performance promised to be his easiest yet. Combat protocols initialized, announced the arena's AI with the sort of board efficiency that suggested it had witnessed this particular brand of institutional hazing far too many times. Contestants will engage in full contact evaluation. Victory conditions: submission, incapacitation, or forfeit. Lethal force is prohibited, though the medical bay is standing by out of sheer optimism. The observation deck buzzed with excited chatter as bets were finalized and recording devices activated. Several cadets had already started composing messages to friends back home, eager to share footage of what promised to be the most hilariously one-sided combat demonstration, since someone thought it would be funny to pit a Zephyrian philosopher against a rabid Korvathian warmaster. Maya stepped into the center of the training bay with the casual stride of someone taking a pleasant walk through a park. Her movements held no trace of the nervous energy that typically preceded combat, no visible signs of the fight-or-flight response that every other species exhibited when faced with a Korvathian in full battle gear. If anything, she looked mildly curious about the whole proceedings. Vex'thor, meanwhile, had launched into his pre-combat ritual with all the subtlety of a supernova. His bone ridges fled to their full intimidating height, his muscles tensed in a display designed to showcase Korvathian physical superiority, and his eyes narrowed to predatory slits that had reportedly made lesser beings lose control of their bodily functions. "Human," he snarled, circling Maya like a predator sizing up wounded prey, "your species mistakes technological advancement for evolutionary progress. You build machines to compensate for your biological inadequacies, create weapons to bridge the gap between your limitations and our natural superiority." His voice rose to carry throughout the observation deck, ensuring every spectator could appreciate his eloquence. "Today, you learn why the strong rule and the weak serve." Maya nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words with genuine academic interest. "That's an interesting perspective," she replied conversationally. "Do you always spend this much time talking before a fight, or is this special for the cameras?" The question hung in the air, with the sort of casual insolence that made several observers wince in anticipation. Nobody spoke to Commander Vex'thor like that. Nobody questioned his pre-combat rituals. Nobody treated his intimidation displays like minor inconveniences to be politely acknowledged and dismissed. Vex'thor's bone ridges flared even higher, his yellow eyes blazing with the sort of indignant rage reserved for those unaccustomed to being mocked. "Your impudence will be corrected, human." Painfully. "Combat commencing in 3, 2, 1. Begin," announced the AI with what sounded suspiciously like anticipation. Vex'thor launched himself forward with the devastating power that had earned Korvathians their reputation as the galaxy's premier warriors. His massive frame covered the distance between them in a blur of controlled violence, claws extended, ready to demonstrate the fundamental difference between predator and prey. He never made it halfway. Maya's movement was so quick, so economical, so perfectly timed that most observers missed it entirely. One moment Vex'thor was charging forward like an unstoppable force of nature, the next he was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling with the sort of confused expression typically worn by philosophy students attending their first quantum mechanics lecture. The training bay fell silent with the kind of stunned quiet usually reserved for witnessing violations of fundamental physical laws. Even the AI seemed to pause, its processes apparently requiring additional time to confirm what its senses had recorded. Combat concluded. The AI finally announced, its voice carrying a note of what could charitably be described as professional bewilderment. Duration, 2.3 seconds. Victor, Lieutenant Chen. Vex'thor remained on the floor, not because he was seriously injured, but because his brain was still attempting to process the sequence of events that had led to his current horizontal position. One moment he had been demonstrating Korvathian superiority, the next he was intimately acquainted with the training bay's floor panels. Maya stood over him, extending a hand with the sort of polite courtesy usually offered to elderly relatives who had stumbled while getting up from dinner chairs. "You all right, Commander?" That looked like it might have smarted. The observation deck erupted in the sort of chaos typically associated with reality suffering catastrophic system failures. Cadets stared in slack-jawed amazement. Instructors frantically checked their recording devices to confirm they had actually witnessed what they thought they had witnessed, and betting pool participants began calculating their newly catastrophic financial positions. "Impossible," breathed Instructor HFY, her serpentine form uncoiling in shock. "Korvathians don't lose to humans. It's physically impossible. Our bone density alone should have." "Should have what?" Maya asked pleasantly, helping Vex'thor to his feet with the sort of gentle assistance usually reserved for handling fragile antiques. "Made you heavier? Because in my experience, that just makes you easier targets. More momentum to redirect." Vex'thor staggered upright, his pride considerably more damaged than his body. "What trickery is this? What technology did you use? Humans cannot achieve such victory through natural means." Maya tilted her head thoughtfully, as if considering the question with genuine academic interest. "Natural means? You mean like training? Because I've been doing that since I was 12. Started with basic hand-to-hand combat, moved on to advanced tactical response, spent about 8 years in various conflict zones putting theory into practice." She paused, glancing around at the assembled crowd with mild curiosity. Did nobody think to check my service record before setting up this little demonstration? The question sent a chill through the observation deck that had nothing to do with the environmental controls. Service records were, of course, available for review, but who bothered checking the backgrounds of species everyone knew were inferior? It would be like researching the combat capabilities of houseplants. Professor Grimtalk, his Korvathian pride demanding answers, lumber forward with all the grace of a mobile mountain. Explain yourself, human. What training produces such results? Well, Maya said, settling into the patient tone of someone explaining complicated concepts to particularly dense students, Earth has this interesting habit of testing its military personnel in actual combat situations. We call them wars, though I suppose you might know them better as practical applications of theoretical training. She gestured casually toward Vex'thor, who was still looking like someone who had just discovered that gravity worked differently than expected. Commander Vex'thor here has an impressive record of defeating cadets in controlled training environments. Very different skill set. The implications of her words rippled through the crowd like a shockwave through a crystalline structure. Combat training was one thing, but actual combat experience? Most species in the Galactic Defense Council had evolved beyond such barbaric practices centuries ago. Warfare had become civilized, regulated, conducted through proper channels with appropriate oversight and minimal actual violence. Humans, apparently, had missed that particular memo. How many conflicts? Asked Instructor HFY, her voice carrying the sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for studying particularly gruesome historical events. Maya considered the question thoughtfully. Personally, let's see, 3 major engagements, probably a dozen smaller operations, couple of extraction missions that got interesting, few peacekeeping deployments that weren't particularly peaceful. She shrugged apologetically. Earth's a busy place. Lots of disagreements that need sorting out. The silence that followed could have been sold as premium-grade vacuum to spacecraft manufacturers. The concept of species engaging in regular, ongoing combat with members of their own kind was so foreign to most galactic civilizations that several observers were beginning to show signs of cognitive strain. Vex'thor finally found his voice, though it came out several octaves higher than his usual intimidating growl. You fight other humans? Regularly? Well, not recreationally, Maya replied with the sort of casual tone usually reserved for discussing weekend hobbies. Though some of my colleagues might disagree with that assessment. Point is, when Earth decides to send a representative to the galaxy's most prestigious military academy, we don't typically choose someone from the accounting department. The observation deck had devolved into the sort of barely controlled chaos usually associated with paradigms shifting without proper warning. Betting pools were being frantically recalculated. Service records were being desperately accessed, and several species representatives were quietly re-evaluating their assumptions about human capabilities. Commander Vex'thor, meanwhile, was experiencing the sort of existential crisis typically reserved for discovering that fundamental constants of the universe were more like gentle suggestions. His entire worldview had been constructed around the principle of Korvathian superiority, and that foundation had just been demolished by a human female who barely reached his shoulder and spoke with the casual courtesy of someone discussing the weather. This changes nothing, he declared with the sort of desperate conviction usually employed by people trying to convince themselves of obvious falsehoods. One fortunate strike does not negate centuries of proven superiority. Demand rematch. Multiple opponents. Full combat protocols. Maya glanced around the observation deck, her expression suggesting mild interest rather than concern. Multiple opponents. Sure, if you think that would help. Though I should mention that most of my training focused on dealing with numerical disadvantages. Single opponents are actually kind of refreshing. The offer hung in the air, like an unexploded ordnance device, radiating potential for catastrophic outcomes. Several instructors exchanged the sort of meaningful looks typically shared by people realizing they had vastly underestimated the scope of their problems. Perhaps, suggested Professor Grimtalk with the sort of diplomatic caution usually employed around unstable explosives, we should review Lieutenant Chen's full service record before proceeding with additional demonstrations. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement from everyone except Vex'thor, who was still grappling with the reality that his reputation as an unstoppable combat instructor had been ended by someone who looked like she could be knocked over by a strong breeze. Maya checked her wrist chronometer with the casual efficiency of someone keeping track of appointment schedules. Actually, I should probably mention that this was just a preliminary evaluation, right? The real training starts tomorrow. She glanced around the assembly with what might have been anticipation. Looking forward to it. Should be interesting to see what everyone's capable of when they stop assuming and start actually trying. The implications of her statement sent another wave of concerned murmuring through the crowd. If this had been Maya's performance during a casual preliminary evaluation, what would she be capable of during actual training exercises? Instructor HFY slithered closer, her serpentine form coiling with nervous energy. Lieutenant Chen, perhaps you could clarify the extent of human combat capabilities? For academic purposes, of course. Maya considered the question with the sort of thoughtful expression usually worn by people trying to explain complex concepts in simple terms. Well, I'm probably somewhere in the middle range for special operations personnel. Above average for regular military, but nothing particularly exceptional by elite standards. She paused, glancing around at the assembled crowd. Earth has about 8 billion people, so our selection pools are pretty competitive. 8 billion. The number hung in the air like a mathematical impossibility. Most species considered populations in the hundreds of millions to be crowded, but 8 billion individuals all competing for limited positions in military organizations? The implications were staggering. How many of these 8 billion are trained for combat? Asked Professor Grimtalk with the sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for studying natural disasters. Depends on your definition of trained, Maya replied thoughtfully. Active military is maybe a few 100 million across various nations and organizations. Then you've got reserves, veterans, law enforcement, private security, competitive martial artists, recreational fighters. She shrugged apologetically. Earth keeps pretty detailed statistics, but I'm not a demographic specialist. A few 100 million. Several observers were beginning to show signs of the sort of mathematical vertigo typically experienced by people attempting to comprehend truly large numbers. The idea that any single species could maintain that many individuals trained for combat was beyond their conceptual framework. Commander Vex'thor, who had been quietly processing the implications of his defeat, finally found his voice again. These other humans, are they all like you? Maya tilted her head thoughtfully, as if considering the question with genuine academic interest. Like me how? If you mean combat trained, then some are better, some are worse. If you mean generally unimpressive looking, then yeah, most humans probably wouldn't meet your standards for physically intimidating. The answer seemed to deflate whatever remained of Vex'thor's confidence. The possibility that Maya represented an average example of human military capability, rather than an exceptional case, was apparently too much for his worldview to process. I believe, announced Professor Grimtalk with the sort of diplomatic timing usually employed to prevent diplomatic incidents from escalating into actual warfare, that this concludes today's evaluation exercises. All personnel are dismissed to review educational materials. The observation deck began clearing with a sort of purposeful urgency usually associated with avoiding awkward conversations about catastrophic miscalculations. Betting pools were quietly dissolved, recording devices were discreetly deactivated, and service record databases were accessed with unprecedented enthusiasm. Maya finished collecting her equipment with the same methodical efficiency she had demonstrated throughout the entire proceedings. As she headed toward the exit, she paused next to Commander Vex'thor, who was still standing in the center of the training bay with the shell-shocked expression of someone whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been forcibly revised. Commander, she said with genuine courtesy, thanks for the warm welcome. Looking forward to working with everyone. She paused thoughtfully. Oh, and you might want to update your training protocols. Fighting cadets who are expecting to lose isn't great preparation for opponents who aren't planning on cooperating. Vex'thor watched her leave, his yellow eyes following her casual stride with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for studying particularly dangerous predators. For the first time in his career, He found himself wondering if perhaps the galaxy's understanding of species hierarchy might require some minor adjustments. The training bay fell silent except for the gentle hum of environmental systems and the distant sound of Vex'thor's ego deflating like a punctured atmospheric seal. Somewhere in the Academy's administrative offices, a clock was quietly updating the official records to reflect the shortest instructor versus cadet bout in institutional history. Tomorrow's training exercises, it seemed, were going to be considerably more interesting than anyone had anticipated. The galaxy's most prestigious military academy had just discovered that their understanding of human capabilities had been slightly off by several orders of magnitude. Commander Vex'thor stood alone in the training bay, staring at the spot where his reputation had died a quick and embarrassing death. In the distance, he could hear the sound of betting pools being hastily recalculated and service records being frantically reviewed. For the first time in his long and distinguished career, he found himself genuinely curious about tomorrow's classes. And perhaps, he thought with the sort of grim resignation usually reserved for facing inevitable disasters, it was time to update his retirement plans. After all, there was something to be said for maintaining one's dignity while it was still technically possible to do so.